name is Michelle Key, and I'm one of the fellows from Public Counsel. And I'll be talking to you all a little bit today about workplace vaccination policies, some questions you may have. I'm joined by my colleague Dee, who will present the second half of the presentation, and then we will answer questions at the end. We'll save some time at the end for Q&A. If you have any questions that come up during the presentation, feel free to type them in the chat. We'll be monitoring them. We may answer them if they are timely throughout the presentation, but if we don't get to them, don't worry, we'll probably get to them at the end. Talia, if you could go to the next slide. I'll just start off by reading our disclaimer. So this presentation provides general guidance only and should not be construed as legal advice. The law on the topics discussed in this presentation is highly context specific. If you or your childcare need legal assistance, or if you have further questions about these topics, please contact Public Counsel's Community Development Project. I believe Dee sent the link in the chat, and you'll also get it at the end, and it should be included in the presentation. This presentation should not be construed as all-inclusive, nor as the provision of legal services to any individual or entity. Attending this presentation does not create any lawyer-client relationship between you and Public Counsel. The information in this training is current as of today, December 7th, 2021. And as we have all been seeing, rules and laws related to COVID-19 are changing quickly, and information in this training may become out of date at a later point. So next slide, please. In today's presentation, we'll cover a variety of questions. We'll start with whether childcare providers are required to be vaccinated. Then we'll go through whether you should mandate the COVID-19 vaccines, whether you can require employees to get the vaccines, whether you can require proof of vaccination. If you choose to have a vaccination policy, what should it include? What are some factors you should be considering? How you should deal with employees who refuse to get vaccinated and fail to request reasonable accommodations. We'll also talk about whether you can require parents and children to be vaccinated. Obviously, not all children can be or are eligible for the vaccine, so we'll talk about that. And then, as I mentioned, we'll save some time at the end for questions. Okay, so next slide, please. So first, are providers required to be vaccinated? So currently, there are no federal, state, or local laws that mandate childcare providers to be vaccinated against COVID-19 in order to continue to operate the childcare program. However, something that you should note is that federal contractors and their employees must be fully vaccinated by January 18th of next year, which means that you should have your second dose of the vaccine by January 4th if you're getting Pfizer or Moderna, or if you're getting the Johnson & Johnson vaccine, which is just one dose, you should be vaccinated by January 4th, as fully vaccinated means 2 weeks after you have received your final dose of the vaccine. Also, if you are a Head Start or an early Head Start provider, you must be vaccinated by January 31st of next year. For that, they're requiring that contractors, providers, and even volunteers have their second dose in a 2-dose series or the first of the Johnson & Johnson vaccine by January 31st of 2022. We'll talk about some exemptions later, but Head Start programs may also allow for exemptions to the vaccination requirement for those who cannot be vaccinated due to medical conditions, religious beliefs, practices, or observances. And for those granted a vaccine exemption, there is a weekly testing requirement. So for Head Start and early Head Start providers, if you are granting someone a vaccine exemption, they must be tested weekly for COVID-19, and I think it has to be the PCR test. And without an approved vaccine exemption for those folks, there is no option for testing as an alternative to receiving the vaccine. And then licensees and providers must continue to mitigate the spread of COVID-19. So that's the guidance that the California Department of Public Health has published and continues to encourage public health providers to do all that they can to limit the spread of COVID-19 in their communities and in their workplaces. So next slide, please. So you might be wondering whether it's a good idea for you to mandate vaccinations for COVID-19. We've seen a lot of people, a lot of states, cities, school districts are mandating vaccines. And some benefits to mandating vaccinations are that, everyone in the workplace and the community will be extra protected. In terms of finances, because COVID-19 breakouts may cause absences, in addition to health consequences, employees may have to take time off. They may not be able to come in even after they are no longer, even after they are well. They might have lingering side effects that may prevent them from being as fully engaged as they were before, which could cost the workplace and the childcare some productivity. You may also have to close the childcare if you have a breakout at your childcare center. We've certainly had clients come to us because they've either had a child or a family have COVID, which has affected their childcare being open. And so having a mandatory vaccination policy, as it reduces the likelihood that people may contract COVID, could also reduce the likelihood that you may have to close. It'll also reduce the risk of liability you may have if an employee or a family member or a child were to contract COVID from your childcare center. We know that there are some downsides of a mandatory vaccination policy. Obviously, as we mentioned, the law is changing pretty quickly, and so there isn't as much precedent or examples that you may have to rely on in implementing this vaccination policy. Another thing that people have been seeing is that some people may not want to be vaccinated, including employees and families, and you may face some, pushback from those who may not want to be vaccinated. And so those are some things to keep in mind. Next slide, please. Okay, but can you require your employees to get vaccinated? And the answer here is generally yes. In California, employers can require employees to get the COVID-19 vaccine, but this is subject to some exceptions that we'll discuss. First is a disability-related accommodation. Second, religious practice, belief, or observance-related exemption. And third is for pregnancy. So we'll talk about these in a little bit more detail in the next few slides, but it's important to know that these exist. And before implementing a vaccination policy, it's best that you speak to a lawyer to make sure that you're abiding by all of the relevant laws. And I'm sure, as we're all familiar, the 3 authorized vaccines were listed in the previous slide. So disability-related accommodations are what we'll talk about first. So under both federal law, the Americans with Disabilities Act, and California state law, the Fair Employment and Housing Act, under the California. So that's the California law, and the federal law is the Americans with Disabilities Act, sorry. So under both of those laws, employers must accommodate employees who have disabilities and make them known to the employer. And so if an employee comes to you and says, I cannot get the vaccine due to my disability, then the employer must engage in a timely and good faith interactive process, which means that you need to see if there are some reasonable accommodations that you can make for the employee so that they can continue to work without getting the vaccine. And some examples of reasonable accommodations that you may be able to make include providing and requiring the use of PPP, making sure that people are able to be socially distanced at work. As we've stated earlier, a weekly COVID-19 test may also be a reasonable accommodation, allowing employees to work from home. But obviously not all of that applies. If you are running a childcare center, it's really difficult for someone to help you if they're working remotely from their home. And so not all of these examples will apply to you and your situation. And reasonable accommodations for both disability-related reasons and religious exemptions and pregnancy, they're all context specific. So it's important that you do this for every employee that you may have. And we'll talk about this a little bit later, but if you are mandating this policy for families as well, then you'll have to do it for every family that may raise a potential issue. If someone asks for accommodation, retaliation, and disclosure of their request are prohibited. And so you may ask, what if a reasonable accommodation cannot be made? So next slide, please, Talia. So if a reasonable accommodation cannot be made, then you may exclude the employee from the workplace, which means you may terminate or place them on unpaid leave. And before you do so, again, you should consult with legal counsel. But situations in which this may arise is that if the accommodation poses an undue hardship, or if the employee is unable to perform their essential duties, even with the reasonable accommodations, or if the employee cannot perform those duties in a manner that does not pose a direct threat to the health or safety of individuals in the workplace. And I think state guidelines have stated that a direct threat, COVID-19 and the spread of COVID-19 does pose a direct threat to the health or safety of individuals in the workplace. And so we'll take a little bit of time now to talk a little bit about what undue hardship and what direct threat may be. So next slide, please. Yes. Oh, perfect. Okay, so undue hardship means that it requires a significant difficulty or expense in consideration of various factors, including 1, the nature and cost of the accommodation, 2, the employer's financial ability to provide the accommodation, the total number of employees, and the impact of the accommodations on the operation of the business, and 3, the nature of the business or operation. So for childcare providers, they would consider the fact that you're a childcare provider, that childcare, it would be difficult to provide that, if the employee is not physically present. They would also consider if you have just one employee who's helping you out versus maybe 50 employees, and what it would look like if they were supposed to, if you were to provide reasonable accommodations such as weekly testing or social distancing, et cetera, how that would affect your business. And so you would consider all of these things. And if you decide that those things are too big of a difficulty or expense, then it may pose an undue hardship. So next, what is a direct threat to the health and safety of coworkers or employees? A direct threat is a significant risk of bodily harm, and it can take into consideration 1, whether the requested accommodation would constitute a direct threat to the health or safety of others, whether the risk would cause substantial physical damage to the property of others, and 3, if such risks cannot be sufficiently mitigated or eliminated by another reasonable accommodation. And so for all of these things, employers should conduct an individualized assessment per employee that requests an accommodation, and that individualized assessment should rely on objective evidence rather than, how someone may be feeling about certain things, but based on things such as cost or time lost, etc. Okay, so now I'll turn it over to Dee, who will discuss religion-related accommodations and the pregnancy exemption before they talk about the rest of the presentation and whether you can require proof of vaccination and things like that.
Thank you, Michelle. In addition to disability-related accommodations, there are religion-related accommodations that can be made. So there's a requirement to accommodate when an employer must reasonably accommodate an employee's sincerely held religious beliefs, practices, or observances, unless doing so would result in an undue hardship. And Michelle described a bit of the undue hardship requirements. And again, if an employee asks for a religion-related accommodation, retaliation is prohibited by the employer. So some examples of reasonable accommodations in this case can include some of the reasonable accommodations previously listed, as well as ones that eliminate the conflict between the sincerely held religious belief or practice of the employee and the vaccination requirement. And this may include job restructuring, job reassignment, or modification of work practices. Because it's about a sincerely held religious belief, employers should assume that an employee's stated religious belief is both religious and sincerely held. So unless the employer has a good faith and objective basis for questioning the religious nature or sincerity of the stated belief, then the employer should consider it to be sincerely held. Beyond that, asking more questions and probing the sincerity of the religious belief is a little bit risky for the employer. So unless there's some obvious reason why you think that it's not a sincerely held religious belief, then you should take the employee at their word, basically. Yeah, and we can go to the next slide, please. So next we'll talk, the final exemption would be the pregnancy exemption. And there is a requirement to accommodate pregnant employees as well. So an employer cannot discriminate against an employee on the basis of pregnancy. The employer must reasonably accommodate an employee who is pregnant to the extent that accommodations are provided to similarly situated employees. And again, retaliation is prohibited from retaliating against an employee who requests an exemption. Examples of reasonable accommodations in this instance would be remote work arrangements, changes to work schedules or assignments, or a temporary leave. And again, you want to make sure that they're not discriminated against compared to similarly situated employees. And those would be employees who are not pregnant, but are similarly situated in the workplace. We can go to the next slide, please. Oh, sorry, you're on. Yes, that's the correct slide. Thank you. We've talked about the exemptions that are allowed if you were to implement a mandatory vaccination policy. And so you may be wondering if you can require proof of vaccination. And so outside of those exemptions that we just listed, yes, you generally can require proof of vaccination. And so you can require this proof if a vaccination is administered by a third party, or if the employer themselves administers the vaccination. And there are 3 acceptable options for obtaining employees' vaccination information. One would be where the employees provide proof of vaccination. So that could be in the form of a vaccine card or an image of the vaccine card or some other health document showing vaccination status. And the employer maintains a copy of that proof. The next would be where the employee provides proof of vaccination and the employer maintains a record of the employee who presented proof, but not the vaccine record itself. And then the third would be where the employee self-attests to the vaccination status and the employer maintains a record of who self-attests. So in each of these cases, you want to maintain the proof of vaccination as confidential medical records separate from the other employee files. So you want to make sure that these medical records are not accessible by everybody and that they're confidential and people who are looking through the employee files won't be able to see these medical records that show proof of vaccination. So after you've requested proof of vaccination from the employees, you'll want to be careful about the kinds of questions you ask, for the kinds of follow-up questions you ask. So an employer is limited by the types of questions that are allowable regarding the employee's disability, religious creed, or medical status. So again, you want to limit the scope of follow-up questions, and you should instruct the employee to omit any other medical or family history information from their documentation so that you're not inadvertently collecting their medical information where you have to store those confidential kinds of things. So again, when asking follow-up questions, limit them to the type of proof that you're needing for vaccination or that you're requiring from the employee. Next slide, please. So we've received some questions from some providers or employers and other childcare programs that ask if the childcare program can disclose if any of their employees are vaccinated. And so while the employers can show that they have a mandatory vaccination policy in place, they cannot disclose an employee's vaccination status to others, as this is confidential medical information. So you can't freely disclose to your clients, the children that attend your program, or their parents. Some key considerations, again, are to keep confidential any employee health information you obtain, and to keep an employee's medical file separate from the employee's personnel file. So you might be wondering what you can share then. So some things you can share in relation to COVID vaccinations include an aggregate and anonymous numbers about the vaccination rate. So for example, if 80% of your staff are vaccinated, you can share that with your clients. You can also share that you have a mandatory vaccination policy in place. And then your employees themselves may voluntarily share information with others about their vaccination status. So if there is an employee working with some children or clients within your program, and they want to tell the children or the children's parents that they're vaccinated, they're allowed to share that information themselves. So if you decide to move forward with mandating vaccinations and drafting a policy, again, we suggest that you seek out legal advice or contact us to assist you with drafting or creating a vaccination policy. But some of the things to include, and again, each employment context is different, so these are suggestions on what to include in the policy. But some of the major areas would be the scope of the policy and which employees it applies to, the reason behind the policy, so that you can convey some of the safety concerns that Michelle mentioned at the beginning of the presentation, and why you're mandating vaccines and creating this policy. A deadline by when employees must be fully vaccinated. You want to clearly identify the vaccination verification process. So again, how you want to collect proof of vaccination, what the employees must provide to show that proof. You want to state clearly any potential consequences of violation. This could include reasonable disciplinary policies and practices, which the employee may be subject to if they don't provide proof of vaccination or receive vaccination by the deadline you've set out. An outline of the legally authorized exemptions to the vaccine. So again, that would be the disability-related accommodations, religion-related accommodations, and any pregnancy accommodations. Information on the steps to take to request a reasonable accommodation if they fall into one of the authorized exemptions. And a statement that the employer is not obligated to accept every accommodation. Only reasonable accommodations must be made, except in the case of undue hardship, which Michelle described previously. And again, we just want to emphasize that employers should speak with legal counsel before preparing a mandatory policy, and public counsel, if you qualify for our services, can assist you in drafting any kind of mandatory vaccination policy. Next slide, please. So there are a few other factors to consider if you're to move forward with a mandatory vaccination policy. There may be some payroll obligations that pop up. So if an employer mandates vaccinations or COVID testing the employer must pay the employee for time spent getting a vaccine or testing. And this may include travel time or hours worked that are in addition to the other hours that the employee might have worked. And then employers with more than 25 employees must provide, are mandated to provide paid COVID-19 related sick leave. In addition to, so this might apply if an employee is getting COVID testing or a vaccine, that those kinds of funds might apply to that, that process. You want to reimburse employees for out-of-pocket costs for the vaccination. So this could include, payment for, if they're going someplace to get a vaccination and they have to pay for parking or something like that, you want to reimburse any out-of-pocket costs related. So the employer must ensure that the employee is compensated properly. This includes any overtime that might have popped up if the hours worked were overtime, or the hours taken to go get a vaccine or a COVID test applied to overtime. And you also want to be mindful of any meal or rest breaks that are required if for some reason the employee goes to get a vaccine or testing, and let's say that they've worked over their hours and they haven't gotten enough time for meal or rest breaks. You want to make sure that they do build that time in to that process as well. So we've also gotten some questions on whether employers can provide incentives for their employees to get vaccinated. So employers generally can offer incentives for vaccinations. This should not be an incentive that would tend to discriminate against the whole group. So for example, if an employer offers an incentive such as cash bonuses or paid time off for employees who get the vaccine, then the employer should offer alternative options for earning the incentives to individuals who are entitled to exemptions. So for example, if someone's entitled to a disability-related exemption, you can offer an educational safety course as an alternative to obtaining the vaccine in order to avoid any discrimination claims. So if an employee were to attend that optional education safety course, they should qualify to receive the incentive in place of getting the vaccine, basically. Next slide, please. So once you've mandated vaccines, you may come up on a situation where an employee has failed to comply with the vaccination requirements and failed to request a reasonable accommodation. So where possible, the employer can follow the following framework to respond to employees who fail to comply with the vaccination requirements. So first, you'll want to follow up with the employee to understand why they have not provided proof of vaccination and or to better understand their concerns. So remember to be mindful of the follow-up questions you ask. As I mentioned in the requiring proof of vaccination slide, you want to make sure that the follow-up questions stick to information about whether or not they are able to provide proof of vaccination and what kind of accommodation they might be requesting, but not seek out any confidential medical information. Second, if it's appropriate, you want to provide resources on vaccine safety and their efficacy, and the importance of the vaccine to controlling the COVID-19 pandemic. And you want to encourage your employees to reconsider their decision not to get the vaccine. You might consider adjusting the vaccination timeframe that you set out in your policy. Some employees might become more confident as they see their coworkers getting the vaccine to get the vaccine. So sometimes an adjusted timeframe might help in encouraging that process along. And then third, if the employee continues to refuse to be vaccinated or fails to meet the deadline to provide proof of vaccination for an unprotected reason, again, not for the reasons that we listed previously, but for an unprotected reason, then you as the employer can decide whether further action, such as excluding the employee from the workplace, mandatory leave without pay, or termination of the employment relationship is appropriate. And again, at that point, if you're considering taking further steps because an employee is not following your requirements, it might be best to consult an attorney before terminating that employee so that you can reduce the risk of liability for whatever reason that termination of the employee maybe wasn't appropriate at the time or wasn't the best option. So to talk through your options and make the best decision, it might be a good idea to consult an attorney at that point. Next slide, please. Lastly, we want to talk a little about whether you can require parents and children to be vaccinated. So Michelle went through, whether providers need to be vaccinated, and then we talked a little bit about requirements for if you want to require your employees to be vaccinated. And if you are looking to reduce the risk of COVID spread within your program, and you want to consider requiring parents and children to be vaccinated, generally you can require parents and children to be vaccinated subject to potential disability-related accommodations. So childcare providers are public accommodations. Just like other public accommodations like restaurants and bars, providers can require vaccination of their clients who are their parents and children who are age eligible for the vaccine. They can be required to receive a vaccine before attending your program. There are no laws currently prohibiting childcare providers from requiring vaccines of parents and children. But again, you'll want to consider any potential disability-related accommodations. Additionally, there is an importance of maintaining records. If a provider does mandate the vaccinations of children and parents, it's recommended that confirmation of that vaccine be documented in the same way that other immunizations are documented and maintained in the facility file. Those confirming vaccinations can review and accept a hard copy or digital copy of the vaccine. So either one will suffice, but again, you want to keep those in the same way that you keep other immunizations in your facility file. Some providers may choose to not require parents to get vaccinated because of the work it takes to process accommodation requests and the risk of being sued by somebody who is upset by the policy. There's also a risk if you unreasonably denied a disability-related accommodation. So again, some of this is a bit risky, mandating parents and children to be vaccinated, but it is very much a possible option. So there is a balance of these interests, a balance of the costs discussed and reporting an outbreak to the regional office, dealing with concerned parents, et cetera. So in order to make sure that the health and safety of your program is considered, you might want to consider requiring parents and children to be vaccinated. But it does take a little bit of creation of policies and procedures to make sure that you're doing it in the right way. You're making sure that you're collecting the appropriate information, storing it the correct way, and communicating the information to the parents involved. And also that you have process in place to make sure that you're not you're providing disability-related accommodations. So again, because this process is kind of difficult, you'll want to consult with a lawyer before drafting such policy, and Public Counsel is here to assist in drafting these kinds of things as well. So policies like this would go into your parent-provider handbooks and tie into the other COVID-related provisions in that handbook to make sure that you are protecting your clientele as well as your employees and yourself from the risk of the COVID spread. I believe that's it for that slide. You can go to the next slide. Here are some resources for if you'd like to read more about COVID policy, COVID vaccine policies in your workplace, as well as some other guidance provided by the Department of Public Health and other California guidance. Next slide, please. So I wanted to just wrap up a little bit of the presentation portion before we jump into questions and answers by again letting you all know that Public Counsel is able to assist with drafting any kind of mandatory vaccination policy that you might need, as well as any information about requiring parents and children to be vaccinated and putting that information into your parent-provider contracts so that you can clearly outline the process for parents and clients who might be joining your program and ensure that the procedure is being followed. So we are available to work with you all on that. We are currently not taking on new matters before the holidays. So we are going to include our link to sign up for our programs, but you can contact us via phone or email, but it's best to contact us after January 3rd when we will be accepting new clients for these kinds of matters. But I'm going to include our website again here. And a link to actually apply it through our application. But again, you'll want to access that after January 3rd. But yeah, so here is our phone number and also our online intake form. The intake form will be active after January 3rd, where we will then start taking on new clients and can assist with any kind of policy creation that you all have. And I think that is it for the presentation portion. Again, we wanted to keep open some time for questions and answers. And thank you all so much for listening to that, that portion of the presentation.
I did want to make one final comment. I meant to mention this when we were talking about the disability-related accommodations, but the ADA, or the Americans with Disabilities Act, so the federal law, that applies to employers with 15 or more employees. And the FEHA, which is the state law, that applies to employers with 5 or more employees. And the FEHA covers both disability-related accommodations and religious accommodations that employers would have to make. And so while it may not apply to everybody that joined us tonight, these are things that, should keep in mind, and it would be good practice for you to do regardless of whether you have just one employee or 5 or 6 employees. And it certainly would still apply if you were to require them for families and parents as well.
If any of you would like to unmute yourself and you can ask the questions as well, we're available to answer any questions related to any of the topics we discussed. If you want us to go further into any of the topics, we are able to do that as well.
I have a question.
Go ahead.
Can you confirm the age for the children to receive these shots?
Michelle, do you know the current age for children to be vaccinated?
Yeah, I think it's 5 and up are allowed to receive it.
Okay. Thank you.
I have a question. I'm not sure that it's related to the vaccinations, but we have children who have been exposed at school, and so they are forced to quarantine at home for 10 days. However, the parents have to go to work, and they're asking us providers if we could care for them. Are we allowed to do that?
No, because during the quarantine period, they are supposed to be isolated and away from other people. So I would not care for a child unless that's the only child you're caring for and you are okay with potentially being exposed to COVID. But I would not do that.
Okay, because they kind of deceive us into not telling us the truth. So it's kind of risky and tricky.
Yeah, I understand that. I mean, there are always going to be people that don't tell the truth. And part of this is like, depending on people to be honest and responsible and like trying to contain the spread of this virus and doing it for the health of the community. But yeah, I mean, if they're not telling you the truth and you're not aware, then there's only so much you can do. But if you suspect that, the reason the child's not in school is because of the exposure to COVID, you definitely should push back and explain, that, you're not going to be taking care of kids who might have been exposed because it presents a hazard or health issue for like you and all your family and the kids you're caring for.
Right. Okay. Thank you.
I will mention that something that we've been doing for a lot of our providers is updating their contracts with COVID-19 provisions. So if you have contracts, but your contracts don't necessarily have any sections or provisions that discuss COVID-19. So things such as, what should parents tell you should they tell you if they've been exposed? What are your pickup and drop off policies going to be? Are you going to require that children quarantine if they've been exposed before they're allowed to come back to the childcare? So if you have if you would like your contracts to be updated with COVID-19 provisions, that is something that we can help you do just after January 3rd.
Will you be giving another seminar after January 3rd to help us with the contracts?
We've given such a seminar a few times this year through this group. So, we're definitely open to doing another one in the new year if that seems like there's enough interest. Yes.
Thank you.
And we can also, after this training, email all of you or Alyssa our sample contract that has the COVID regulations in it so that you all can see what it says.
I'm gonna put in the chat the contract that y'all sent us when Public Counsel did this training for us the last time.
I'm not sure. I can't remember when that date was, but there might have been some updates to the contract, just because some of the guidance on, for example, like isolation or quarantine dates might have changed. And so maybe we should send you the updated version that you can send out to folks.
That would be perfect. I think the last one we have is from January. So
yeah, so we've updated a little bit of that. Yeah.
Perfect.
There's a question in the chat that says, what is the percentage to close a center in COVID spreads? And I'm not sure if I'm quite understanding the question correctly, but I think it's asking, at what point, or, I guess how many positive cases or at what percentage of the employees or the families at a childcare contracting COVID should the childcare center close? Just correct me if I'm wrong, Maria. I think that's how I'm interpreting the question. And I mean, Dee or Ritu, feel free to jump in, but.
Yeah, so I think that is what it's asking, Michelle. I don't have that number off the top of my head, but there's really clear LA County Department of Public Health guidance that kind of has flow charts and information on, how to report and when to report, COVID exposure cases, but also when there might be, I guess, what's called an outbreak that would necessitate, I think first step is maybe a closure of the classroom where the child is. But we can send that document around after this training because that would have the best information on this topic.
I'm going to post in the chat the main site where you can find that information. So they have the LA County Department of Public Health has their ECE toolkit there. And that includes, all of the reporting requirements and guidance for childcare providers. If there's an outbreak and whatnot. I haven't looked through it to see the number that that counts as an outbreak, but it is on that website.